She had not meant to do it. That was the thing Mara Voss would come back to, years later, in the quiet hours when memory had a way of surfacing without permission. She had not meant to actually do it. The dare had been Lena's idea. The way most catastrophic things in Mara's life had been Lena's idea, born somewhere between the third glass of wine and the kind of reckless amusement that only blooms in a room full of people you are trying to impress. It had started, as these things tend to, with a man nobody could stop looking at. He was standing at the far end of the great hall of Ashenvale House, which was the sort of venue that required an invitation to enter and a reason to leave, a restored estate on the edge of the city that hosted charity galas and private exhibitions and events that cost more to attend than most people earned in a month. Mara was there because her employer, a gallery owner named Mr. Fitch, had given her 2 tickets and told her to network. She was there with Lena because Lena owned exactly 1 formal dress and had been looking for an occasion to wear it since February. The man at the far end of the hall had dark hair, the kind that looked black in certain light and very nearly so in any other, and he was tall in a way that was not immediately about height, but about the particular stillness of someone who had long since stopped needing to fill a room with noise. He was wearing a suit that had no visible lapel pin or pocket square, nothing decorative at all, which somehow made him more noticeable than everyone around him who had tried. He was holding a glass he had not drunk from. He was not talking to anyone. He had been standing in that same position for 40 minutes, which Mara knew because she had looked over 3 times, and each time he had not moved. "Who is that?" Lena said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't know." Mara looked away. "Someone important, probably. He's been standing there alone for the entire night. Some people like standing alone. Nobody likes standing alone at a gala." Lena refilled her glass from a passing tray with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had attended enough of these events to know exactly when the good trays came around. "He looks like he's waiting for something. Or he's just cold," Mara said, and she had meant it as a throwaway observation, because that was exactly the word that had come to her when she first looked at him. Cold, not cruel, not distant in the way of someone deliberately performing unavailability. Cold in the way of something that has been that temperature for a very long time and has simply forgotten what warm was. Lena turned to look at her with the particular expression she wore when an idea was forming that Mara was going to regret. "I dare you," she said. "No, you didn't even hear what I was going to say." "I don't need to." Lena smiled. "I dare you to go over there and kiss him." Mara looked at her. Absolutely not. Not a real kiss. A quick one. On the cheek counts. The cheek does not count as a kiss. Lena, on the mouth then. 1 second. He'll barely notice. He will very much notice. "Mara," Lena set her glass down with the deliberateness of someone making a point. "When is the last time you did something that wasn't on a schedule? When is the last time something happened to you that you didn't plan for?" Mara opened her mouth, closed it. That was the thing about Lena. She had a way of finding the exact nerve and pressing on it without appearing to try. The answer was that Mara could not remember. Her life ran on lists and early mornings and the particular satisfaction of crossing things off. She was good at her job. She had a clean flat and a standing coffee order and a route to work she had not varied in 2 years. She was aware, very efficient and not very alive. "It's 1 kiss," Lena said. "To a stranger you'll never see again." Mara looked across the room. The man with the dark hair had not moved. He was looking at something on the far wall, or perhaps at nothing, it was difficult to tell. Up close, she realized, which was odd because she was not up close. She was still 20 feet away. He would probably be even more still. Even more that word, cold. "If I do this," Mara said, "you are buying dinner for the next 3 months." "Done," Lena said, immediately. Which meant the odds of Mara actually doing it had just gone up considerably. She set her own glass down. She smoothed the front of her dress, which was dark green, and the nicest thing she owned. And she was aware, even as she did it, that smoothing her dress was a completely useless action when what she was about to do was walk across a room and kiss a stranger on the mouth. She started walking before she could think about it too carefully. The hall was crowded enough that the walk took longer than she expected, which gave her time to talk herself out of it twice and back into it once. And then she was there, 3 feet away. 2, close enough to see that his eyes, which she had assumed were dark from across the room, were not dark at all. They were gray. The precise, particular gray of the sky 20 minutes before a storm, when the light goes strange and the air changes and everything becomes very still and very aware of what is coming. He turned his head. He looked at her. Not the way people at Galas looked at each other, with the sliding, assessing glance of someone calculating social worth. He looked at her the way she imagined a person might look at something they had not expected to see and were not yet sure what to do with. She kissed him. Not on the cheek. She had aimed for the cheek, and at the last second her nerve had done something strange, something she could not entirely explain later, and she had kissed him on the mouth instead. Briefly, 1 second. Perhaps 2. His mouth was cool and completely still with surprise, and then, just at the very end, just as she was pulling back, it wasn't. She stepped back. Her face was warm. He was looking at her, and his expression had not changed exactly. It had shifted, very slightly, in a way she could not name. "Sorry," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Dare," he said nothing for a moment. Then, "Who dared you?" "My friend." She gestured vaguely toward Lena, who was across the room pretending to look at a painting, with the unconvincing focus of someone desperately trying not to be seen watching. He looked in that direction. Then, he looked back at Mara. "And what did you win?" 3 months of free dinners. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. The shape that a smile might leave behind if it had been there, and then decided against it. "That seems a reasonable price," he said, for something unreasonable. Mara looked at him. Up close, the coldness she had observed from across the room was different than she had expected. It was not absence. It was more like the surface of something very deep, still because the depth was the point, not the stillness. "I should go back," she said. "You should," he agreed. He did not say anything else. He did not ask her name. He turned back to whatever he had been looking at before she arrived, and Mara walked back across the room with her heart doing something irregular and the entirely irrational sense that she had just done something that was going to matter. Though, she could not have said why, and she would have dismissed the feeling entirely if she had not looked back, just once, from halfway across the room, and found him still watching her. She told Lena it had been fine. That was the word she used. Fine, which was the word she used for things that were either genuinely fine or so far from fine that the only way to process them was to sand them down into something manageable before looking directly at them. Lena did not believe her. Lena had been watching from across the room and had the expression of someone who had expected a quick peck and a retreat, and had instead witnessed something she couldn't quite categorize. "You were there for longer than 1 second, she said. It was still brief. He watched you walk away. People watch things." "Mara." Lena lowered her voice. "Who is he?" "I don't know." "I told you." "You didn't ask his name?" It was a dare, not a conversation. Lena picked up her glass again and looked across the room. The man with the dark hair was no longer at the far end of the hall. He had moved, or left, or simply ceased to be visible, which felt somehow wrong in the way that removing a fixed point from a landscape feels wrong even when you couldn't have said what the landscape was doing with it before. "He's gone," Lena said. Mara did not look. It doesn't matter. She believed this. She went home that night and made tea, and went to bed at the reasonable hour she always went to bed, and she lay in the dark and thought about the specific quality of his eyes before she had kissed him, the way they had moved to her face and stayed there, without the usual social shuffling of a person deciding how much attention to give. She thought about the fraction of a second at the very end of the kiss when his mouth had shifted. Barely, almost nothing. She thought, it doesn't matter. She thought it again, more firmly, and eventually, she slept. She did not find out his name until 4 days later, and she found it out by accident. She was at the gallery on a Tuesday afternoon, cataloging a new acquisition, a set of 19th century botanical illustrations that Mr. Fitch had purchased at auction, and which needed to be logged, photographed, and stored before the end of the week. The gallery was quiet, in the way it always was on Tuesdays, 2 or 3 visitors at most. The kind of people who came to galleries on weekday afternoons because they had time, or because they needed somewhere to be alone in a room with beautiful things. Mara was good at this work. She moved through it with the particular efficiency that came from doing something long enough that it stopped requiring conscious thought, and she was halfway through the 3rd illustration when Mr. Fitch came in from his office with the expression he wore when something had either gone very right or extremely wrong with a client. "Mara," he said, "do you know who attended the Ashenvale Gala on Friday?" She looked up. "I was there." "Yes, I know you were there, that was the point." He set a folded newspaper on the corner of her desk. "Did you happen to notice a man named Caius Varon?" She did not know that name. She was quite certain she did not know that name, and yet something about the 2 syllables of it, the particular weight of them, made her set down her catalog pen with more care than the action required. "No," she said. "Why?" Mr. Fitch tapped the newspaper. "Because he's just offered to loan us 4 pieces from his private collection for the spring exhibition, which would be the largest acquisition this gallery has made in 7 years." He paused. "And because he apparently attended the Ashenvale event, and someone on the committee mentioned that he seemed briefly interested in one of our staff." The word briefly landed with more precision than it had probably been intended to carry. "I don't know who that would be," Mara said, which was not quite a lie. Mr. Fitch looked at her for a moment, in the way of a man who suspected he was being given incomplete information and had decided to accept it for now. "He's coming in on Thursday," he said, "to discuss the loan terms. I'd like you to be here." "Of course," Mara said. He left. She looked at the newspaper. The photograph was small and taken at some public event, the kind of image that newspapers used when the person in question had not made themselves available for a formal portrait. The man in the photograph was standing at the edge of a group, not quite part of it, not quite separate, in the particular way of someone who had chosen to be adjacent rather than included. Dark hair. A certain quality of stillness. She read the caption. Caius Varon, it said. Founder of the Varon Foundation, philanthropist, collector. And then, in the smaller text below, a parenthetical that the journalist had included with what Mara suspected was a degree of editorial satisfaction, rarely photographed, rarely interviewed, rarely seen at public events, and almost entirely unknown despite a private fortune that several publications had attempted to estimate, and none had managed to verify. She set the newspaper down. She thought about a man standing alone for 40 minutes at a gala without speaking to anyone. She thought about a glass he had not drunk from. She thought about the way he had said, "Who dared you?" Not, "What are you doing?" or "Please don't." Just, "Who dared you?" As if the dare itself was the interesting part, rather than the act. She thought, fine. She thought, it still doesn't matter. On Thursday morning, she arrived at the gallery 40 minutes early, which she told herself was because she had things to finish before the meeting, and not for any other reason. She arranged the botanical illustrations. She made 2 cups of tea, and drank one, and let the other go cold. She was standing at her desk with a catalog in her hands. She was not reading when the gallery door opened at 11 exactly, and Caius Varon walked in. He was wearing different clothes, obviously, but the same quality of stillness. He looked around the gallery the way he had looked around the hall, not assessingly, just present, taking in what was there. Then, his gaze moved to her desk, to her, and stopped. She had prepared for this. She had decided how she would handle it, professionally, without reference to Friday night, with the composed efficiency that was, as Lena had unkindly but accurately pointed out, her primary mode of existing in the world. She had it completely managed. Then he crossed the room toward her, and she noticed, up close and in daylight, that his eyes were not simply gray. They were gray with a depth to them that made the gray seem like the surface of something rather than the thing itself, like a lake you could see the top of, but not the bottom. "Miss Voss," he said. He already knew her name. Of course he already knew her name. "We met briefly on Friday." "We did," she said. Her voice was fine. "Mr. Varon." A pause. Something moved in his expression, the same not quite smile from Friday. "You looked me up. My employer told me your name. And did your employer tell you anything else? That you want to loan us 4 pieces for the spring exhibition?" "I do." He glanced at the gallery around them, the clean walls and careful lighting, and the botanical illustrations she had spent Tuesday afternoon cataloging. "You work here." "I do." "You were at the Ashenvale Gala as a representative of this gallery." "Yes." He looked at her. "And the dare," he said, "was unrelated to your professional presence." "Entirely," she said. He nodded once, slowly as if filing this away. "Then I should tell you," he said, "that I don't generally allow people to do what you did on Friday." Mara felt something tighten in her chest. "I apologized. You said sorry. That's not quite the same thing." He held her gaze, and there was nothing aggressive in it, nothing that felt like a threat, just that same quality of directness that had made her feel, on Friday, like she was being seen rather than looked at. "I'm telling you, because it's relevant. I have not been touched without permission in a very long time. By anyone." "I'm sorry," she said, and this time she meant it differently. "I know." A pause. "I'm also telling you because I didn't stop you." The gallery was very quiet. Outside, traffic moved past the windows. Inside, the botanical illustrations hung in their frames, and the second cup of tea had gone entirely cold, and Mara stood very still and tried to understand the shape of what was happening. "Miss Fitch will be out in a moment," she said finally. "Yes," Caius Varon said. "I expect he will." He did not look away. "Miss Voss, what are you doing on Saturday?" She said yes. She told herself she said yes because it would be professionally awkward to say no to a man who was about to loan 4 pieces to her employer's gallery, and she almost believed this for about an hour, which was how long it took Lena to call her on her lunch break, and for the entire story to come out in the way things always came out when Lena was on the other end of the phone, which was to say completely, and in the wrong order. "The man from the gala," Lena said. "The cold one." "Yes, you have a date with the cold man from the gala." "It's not a date." "Mara, he asked what you were doing on Saturday. That's not automatically what did you say when he asked?" Silence. "What did you say?" Lena repeated. "I said I wasn't doing anything." Lena made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite something else, a sound that was Lena's particular version of "I told you so" delivered without the words. "What's his name?" she said. "Caius Varon." A pause on the other end, a longer one than Mara expected. "Lena?" "I know that name," Lena said slowly. "Wait, hang on." The sound of her doing something with her phone. "Mara, how much do you know about him?" "He's a collector. He has a foundation." "Mr. Fitch says he's worth no, not that. Another pause. There are things written about him online they're probably nothing. They're probably the kind of things people write on the internet when someone is private and wealthy and they don't like not knowing things. What kind of things? Theories, Lena said, carefully, about why he doesn't age. Mara stood in the small kitchen at the back of the gallery with her reheated lunch going warm in her hand and felt the sentence land in a way that was slightly off-center, the way a sound does when you hear it in a room with strange acoustics. What? There are photographs, Lena said. From events. Over decades. People who knew him in the 90s, people who knew him in the 70s, further back than that even, there are a few. And in all of them he looks, Mara, he looks exactly the same. That's probably nothing, Lena said quickly. Probably. People look alike. Photographs are inconsistent. Light does strange things. She stopped. Be careful. That's all. Mara thought about this on the way home. She thought about it while she ate dinner, and while she was trying to read, and while she lay in the dark that night, with the particular alertness of a person whose brain has decided that sleep is secondary to the processing of information. She thought about his eyes, the depth of that gray, the sense of something behind the surface, that the surface was not the point of. She thought about the phrase very long time, which was how he had described the period during which no one had touched him without permission. Not a few years, not a long time, a very long time. She thought about the way he had stood in that hall for 40 minutes without speaking to anyone, and had not looked bored or uncomfortable, but simply patient. The patience of something that had learned to wait, because waiting was not the inconvenience it was to other people. She almost canceled on Saturday. She got as far as typing the message, something professional and vague about a scheduling conflict, and then she sat with her thumb over the send button Brachen for long enough that the screen went dark, and she had to unlock it again. And when she did, she deleted the message instead. He had picked a restaurant that was small and not fashionable and very good. The kind of place that did not need to be fashionable because it had been there long enough that fashionable was beside the point. He was already there when she arrived, which she had half expected. Sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall and a clear view of the door, which she noticed, and then noticed herself noticing. You came, he said. I said I would. People say things. He gestured to the chair across from him. Not pulling it out, not performing the gesture, just indicating it, which she found she preferred. She sat. The restaurant was warm and smelled of garlic and old wood, and something she couldn't identify that was pleasant in a way she didn't want to analyze. The light was low. He looked different in it than he had in the gallery, less like the surface of something, and more like the thing itself, which was not a distinction she knew how to explain, and so she did not try. They ordered. He ordered in the easy way of someone who had eaten here before, which he had, he told her, many times over many years, and the way he said many years had a texture to it she couldn't quite grasp. The waiter knew him, not in the familiar way of a regular, but in the respectful way of a staff member who has served someone long enough to know what they prefer and has decided this is worth remembering. Tell me about yourself, he said when the waiter had gone. That's a very conventional opener. Something flickered across his face. I'm told I'm unconventional in other respects. I'm compensating. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came out genuine and slightly unprepared, and she saw him look at her when it did. Not the way people look at things that please them, but the way they look at things they had almost stopped expecting. I work at the gallery, she said. I've worked there for 3 years. Before that, I was at an auction house. Before that, I studied art history, because I thought I wanted to make art, and discovered I was better at understanding it than making it, which is a slightly melancholy realization to have at 22, but ultimately fine. Do you think it's fine now, or did you decide it was fine?" Mara looked at him. "What's the difference?" "One is acceptance," he said. "The other is resignation with better framing." She was quiet for a moment. "Both, maybe," she said honestly. "I think I'm still deciding." He nodded, as if this was a satisfying answer. "What do you understand about it?" he said. "Art. What do you see when you look at things?" Nobody had asked her this in a long time. Not even Mr. Fitch, who cared about art, but in the way of someone who cared about what it represented in terms of taste and value and cultural currency. "Time," she said, and then felt slightly self-conscious about it. "I know that sounds no," he said. "Go on." "I think all art is about time," she said slowly. "About the person who made it being alive in a specific moment and wanting to leave a mark of that. Not necessarily a grand mark, sometimes very small, but proof that they were here and that they saw something and that it was worth recording." She paused. "I find that interesting, that the impulse to make something is really the impulse to persist." He was looking at her in the way he had looked at her across the gala hall, very still, very present. "Yes," he said, quietly, "it is." There was something in his voice when he said it. Not sadness, older than sadness, more worn in, the particular texture of something that has been true for longer than feelings usually last. She almost asked him what he meant. She almost said, "What do you know about persistence?" She didn't. She picked up her glass instead, and he picked up his, and they moved to something else, something easier. And the evening went on, and the food was very good, and the conversation moved through a dozen subjects with the ease of two people who were either well-matched, or careful, or both. And it was late when she looked at her phone and was surprised by the number she found there. "I should go," she said. He walked her out, on the pavement outside the restaurant, in the particular cold of a city night. He stopped and looked at her and said, without preamble, "I'd like to see you again." "You'll see me Thursday," she said. "At the gallery. That's not what I mean." She looked at him. The streetlight made his eyes look different again, less gray and more like something that had absorbed so much light for so long that it had simply run out of room for any more. "I know," she said. Yes, he did not smile. He did just looked at her for a moment, with that particular quality of attention. Then he said, "Good night, Miss Voss," and walked away, and Mara stood on the pavement for longer than was necessary, and thought about the phrase very long time, and thought about photographs that did not change, and thought about the impulse to persist, and did not yet let herself think too directly about any of it. The next 3 weeks were, in the way of things that become significant only in retrospect, very ordinary on the surface. She went to work. She catalogued the botanical illustrations and began preparing the wall space for Caius Varen's loan pieces, which arrived on a Tuesday in a vehicle with no markings and were uncrated by 2 men who did not speak and handled them with the careful, practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times and understood the weight of what they were carrying. The pieces were extraordinary. She stood in front of each one for longer than was strictly professional and did not entirely care. She saw him twice more. Once at the gallery, when he came to approve the installation, which he did in a way that was precise without being difficult, telling her exactly what he wanted, and then stepping back and letting her execute it, which she appreciated. He did not linger. He said her name once, just once, when he was leaving, as if checking that it still fit in the air between them, and she said his name back, which she had not planned to do, and he left. The second time was not planned at all. She was in a bookshop on a Saturday afternoon, the small independent kind that smelled of paper and had a cat that slept on the poetry shelf, and she was standing in the history section trying to decide between 2 books about the Byzantine court when she became aware of someone standing to her left and looked up, and it was him. He was holding a book she recognized, a collection of letters from the 14th century, the kind of primary source material that historians used and most people found unreadable. He was reading it with the ease of someone for whom 14th century correspondence was not a challenge. "Hello," she said. He looked up. If he was surprised, it did not reach his face. "Miss Voss." "Mara," she said. "We've had dinner." A pause. "Mara," he said it differently than he said Miss Voss. Lower, somehow, more like a decision. "Are you here for anything specific?" "History," she said, and showed him the 2 books she was holding. He looked at them, reached out and tapped the one on the left. "That one. The other one has a thesis that doesn't hold." "How do you know?" He held up the letter collection. "I was there for part of it." She stared at him. He said it so flatly, so without drama, that it took several seconds to resolve into meaning. When it did, she felt something go very still inside her. Not fear. Something more like the feeling she had described at dinner, looking at art. That sense of recognizing the impulse to persist. The specific feeling of standing in front of something very old and understanding that it had seen things you hadn't. "You were there," she said carefully, "for part of Byzantine court history." "Not Byzantine," he said. "The letters this book is responding to." The events in France. 1347. He paused. "I was in France in 1347. The bookshop was warm, and the cat was asleep on the poetry shelf, and somewhere at the back someone was making coffee, and Mara stood in the history section and held her 2 books and looked at the man in front of her. He was looking at her, in that steady, present way, not performing the confession, not watching for her reaction with the eagerness of someone who wants to shock, just telling her a thing and waiting to see what she did with it. She started. Stopped. That's a very long time ago. "Yes," he said. "It is." She thought about a very long time. She thought about photographs. She thought about the patience of someone for whom waiting was not the inconvenience it was for other people. She thought about the cold quality she had named from across the hall. Cold not as absence, but as depth. The surface temperature of something that had been alive long enough to learn stillness as a form of survival. She thought about how he had said, at the gallery, "I have not been touched without permission in a very long time." By anyone. "How long?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Longer than you have reference points for." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at the letters in his hand and then at her. Would an answer change what you do next? She thought about this seriously, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. She thought about what she had done on Friday at the gala, which was not a thing she planned, but a thing she did before the planning center of her brain could engage. Some other part of her making a decision that the rational part would not have sanctioned. She thought about saying yes when he asked what she was doing on Saturday. She thought about the dinner, about the way he had asked her what she saw in art, and then gone very quiet when she talked about the impulse to persist. She thought about how she had looked back from halfway across the gala hall and found him watching. "Probably not," she said. No, something moved through his face. Not relief. Not quite. Something older and more complicated, like a feeling that had gone through relief so many times it had worn it smooth. "I'll tell you," he said, "if you want to know. Not here." "All right," she said. She looked down at the books. "This one?" He tapped the left one again. "That one." She bought it. They left the bookshop together and walked along the pavement in the thin November light, and he told her, not everything, not yet, but enough. He told her that he had been what he was for longer than the English language had existed in its current form. He told her that this was not a metaphor or a condition or a story he had constructed for his own interest. He told her that the word most people used for what he was had become so surrounded by fiction that it was nearly useless, but that she was welcome to use it if it helped her organize the information. "Vampire," she said. just to see how it sat. Yes, he said. It sat strangely. It sat the way all true things sit when you have spent your entire life thinking of them as fictional, which was to say badly at first, and then, with adjustment, rather precisely. Does it? She started. Stopped. Is it? She was not usually someone who lost sentences. What is it like? She said finally. A very long time. He walked 3 steps before he answered. Quiet, he said. Eventually, once you stop expecting it to feel the way it felt at the beginning. He paused. The beginning is hard. The middle is easier. By the time you have been alive for several centuries, you have either found a way to be present in it, or you have not, and the ones who have not, he stopped. They become something else. Something that is technically alive but not. I have been careful not to become that. Is it lonely? She said. She had not meant to ask it so directly. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. There have been long periods of very complete solitude, he said. Whether that is lonely depends on what you want. And what do you want? He glanced at her. Just briefly. That, he said, is a more recent question than you might think. She told Lena on Sunday. She told her over the phone because telling Lena things in person meant watching Lena's face do 12 things in rapid succession, and Mara did not have the energy for 12 things. She told her about the bookshop. She told her what Caius had said. She told her about the walk home after, which had been mostly quiet in the way that conversations are quiet when both people are carrying a lot, and have silently agreed that words would only get in the way. There was a very long pause on Lena's end. Say that again, Lena said. Which part? The part where he told you he was alive in 1347. In France. Yes, and you believed him. Mara thought about this seriously. I don't know if believed is the right word, she said. I looked at him when he said it and it fit. The way an answer fits a question you didn't know you were asking. The photographs you mentioned. The patience. The way he talks about time. She paused. He's not lying, Lena. I don't think he's capable of it, actually. I think he's been alive long enough that lying takes more energy than he's willing to spend. Another pause. Are you afraid of him? She had been waiting for that question. She had asked it of herself several times since Sunday afternoon and had arrived each time at the same answer, which was complicated but consistent. No, she said, and I've thought about whether I should be. Mara, I know. He's technically I know what he is. Lena. Do you? She did, actually, or she was beginning to. She was beginning to understand that what he was and who he was were not the same question, the way they were in stories, the way the thing always ate the person in stories. He was not eating her. He was telling her things with the careful honesty of someone who had decided that she deserved the truth and was watching what she did with it. She found this more frightening, actually, than if he had been the story version. The story version required nothing of her. This version required her to think. Over the following weeks, she thought. She saw him 3 more times, each meeting arranged with the same direct simplicity he brought to everything. No games, no ambiguity. Just, are you free Tuesday? And, I'd like to show you something. And each time she said yes, because each time the alternative was to not, and she had discovered that the alternative was not something she was willing to choose. He took her to an archive he had access to through his foundation. Old documents, older maps, things that smelled of 5 centuries of careful preservation. He showed her things without performance. He did not do it to impress her. He did it the way you show a person something you have been alone with for a long time and would like them to see. He showed her a letter, handwritten, in a script that was not quite any modern alphabet, on paper that had the texture of something that had survived because someone had cared for it through many rooms and many years. I wrote this, he said. She looked at the date at the top. She looked at him. You wrote this in 1423. November, yes, who to? Someone who is no longer alive. He said it without grief, which was itself a kind of grief. The particular grief of someone who has been separated from loss by enough time that the loss has become fact. Someone I cared about. She did not ask anything else about that. She recognized a door that was closed, not locked, closed by choice. And she was not the kind of person who opened things without permission. Instead, she looked at the letter, at the handwriting which was precise and even, and somehow familiar. And she thought about the impulse to persist. She thought about a man who had been alive long enough to write letters in a dead script to people who were dead now, and who still, despite all of it, came to a gala and stood alone with an undrunk glass and turned his head when a woman walked toward him, with the expression of someone who did not know what to do with the unexpected. "Why did you come to the gala?" she asked. "I was invited. You don't do things just because you're invited. You told me you rarely attend events." He was quiet. "My foundation has a relationship with the committee," he said. It seemed like the right year to go. He paused. I had been indoors for a long time. She looked at him. "How long?" "Several years. Just in your house?" "I have several houses. The smallest possible ghost of something wry. I rotate." She laughed despite herself, and he looked at her again in that way he had. Like the laugh was a thing he had not expected, and was not sure what to do with, except that he wanted to hear it again. She was starting to understand that he was not cold in the way she had initially thought. He was careful. He was the careful of something that had been alive long enough to know what carelessness cost. What looked like coldness from 20 feet away was, up close, a kind of precision. He chose what he let land. He chose what he let matter. And something about the way he had turned his head when she walked toward him at the gala suggested that she had landed without his permission, which was, she thought, why he had not stopped her. "Were you lonely?" she asked. The several years. He considered this for longer than the question seemed to require. "I was," he said, accustomed to it. "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at the letter he had written in 1423. She looked at his hands, which were the same hands that had written it, long-fingered, steady, the hands of someone who did not gesture when they talked, because they did not need to fill space with movement. She thought about what it was to be accustomed to something you had once wanted differently. She was 31 and she was accustomed to several things that she had not chosen to become accustomed to. She had simply found one day that the wanting had worn to accepting without her noticing the transition, and the distance between her and what Caius Varen carried was one of scale and not of kind. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes, the night at the gala. When you said you don't generally allow people to do that." She paused. "What would have happened if someone else had done it? Someone you didn't," she stopped. Restarted. "What would you have done?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing that would have made the evening pleasant for them," he said. Which was not exactly an answer, but was enough of one. "But you didn't," she said. "No." He held her gaze. "I didn't." She thought about the fraction of a second at the end of the kiss when his mouth had changed. She thought about him watching her walk away. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are things," he said slowly, "that happen in the first second of encountering something, before any reasoning begins, that the rest of you spends a very long time catching up to." He looked at the letter on the table. "I have had several centuries to learn the difference between those things, and things that are simply interesting." A pause. "This is not simply interesting." She did not tell her employer. This was the thing she was least certain about in the weeks that followed, whether not telling him was pragmatic or cowardly, and whether those were even different things. Mr. Fitch was a reasonable man in most respects, and an unreasonable one in a few very specific respects. one of which was the separation of professional and personal, which he held to with the rigidity of a person who had had the boundary violated once and had overcorrected. She told herself that there was nothing yet to tell, which was also, depending on how you squinted, true. What there was this. Caius came to the gallery for the installation review and stayed 20 minutes longer than necessary. The extra 20 minutes spent looking at a small oil painting in the corner that was not part of his loan, a minor Dutch work from the 17th century. A woman at a window. He stood in front of it for a long time. Mara stood nearby and did not interrupt. When he finally spoke, he did not turn around. "I knew the artist," he said. It was a quiet statement. He was 17 when he painted this. He died at 32. He left 9 paintings. This is the one I liked best. He paused. "I'm glad it found somewhere careful." She looked at the painting. She thought about 9 paintings in 32 years. She thought about what it was to watch someone create something and then watch the thing outlast them by 3.5 centuries and still recognize it. "Is it strange?" she said. "Seeing things you remember in galleries." "Sometimes," he turned. "Less strange than seeing things I remember in rubble." A pause. "I prefer galleries." There were things like this, small statements that landed on her at odd angles, that she found herself returning to in the days between seeing him. The way he talked about time was unlike the way anyone else she had ever met talked about time. For everyone she knew, time was either not enough or too much. It was the thing you ran out of, or the thing you couldn't fill. For Caius it was a medium, like water, something you existed inside rather than against. He was not sentimental about his own longevity. He was not cavalier about it either. He simply inhabited it with the particular pragmatism of someone who has had to develop a sustainable relationship with something that was not going to change. She began to understand why he did not drink at Gallus. She began to understand the house in the city, which he had shown her once, briefly, which was very old and very clean and furnished in a way that suggested someone who had learned not to accumulate more than they could leave behind without grief. She began to understand the not-quite smile, and the stillness, and the way he listened to her like she was the most interesting thing in his immediate vicinity, which she was beginning to think was not a social performance, but simply a fact. That she was currently the thing in his immediate vicinity that he found most worth attending to. And the idea of that, the specific weight of being attended to by someone who had been alive since before the printing press, and had developed over several centuries, a very precise sense of what was worth his attention, was something she did not know exactly what to do with, but could not make herself not feel. December arrived. The city did what cities do in December, which is dress itself up and become simultaneously more beautiful and more exhausting. The gallery had a small opening for the loan exhibition, which Caius attended, which was the first time Mara had seen him in a room full of people while also being, herself, in that room. It was interesting. He moved through the space with the same economy he brought to everything, speaking to a small number of people with the focused, brief attention of someone who has learned that most conversations can be accomplished in less time than people think. He did not perform. He did not network in the anxious way of people who needed to. He simply existed in the room and let the room adjust to him, which it did, the way rooms always did, which she had noticed the first night and understood better now. He found her near his own pieces, which she had been studying again with the same slightly unprofessional attention she always gave them. He stood beside her, not speaking immediately, just there. "Which one?" he said. "What?" "If you could take one home." "Which one?" She looked at the 4 pieces, a landscape that was nothing technically exceptional and was nevertheless extraordinary in the way it had captured a specific quality of autumn light that she had never seen rendered quite this precisely before. A portrait of an unnamed woman that was attributed to a minor school and that Mara privately thought was better than the attribution suggested. A small study of hands that was the simplest of the 4. A seascape that had survived some water damage and wore its history openly, the slight discoloration along one edge that no restoration had tried to erase. The seascape, she said. He looked at it. Why? Because it's been somewhere. She paused. It looks like it's been somewhere and survived, and isn't pretending it hasn't. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. Just that. Yes, later, when the opening was winding down and the catering staff were doing the discreet work of beginning to clear and the guests were in the natural process of departure, he walked her to the gallery door and said, very quietly, so only she could hear, I want to tell you something. She looked at him. The gallery behind them was warm and bright. Outside, the December street was cold and illuminated in that particular way of cities at night in winter, everything reflecting off wet pavement, everything a little larger and softer than it was in daylight. All right, she said. In all the time that I have been what I am, he said, there have been very few moments that I did not have to seek out, very few things that came to me rather than requiring me to go toward them. He held her gaze steadily. The last time something simply arrived, without my having looked for it, was not recent. She understood what he was saying. She understood it with a precision that she did not trust herself to respond to immediately. Not here. Not with a room full of people behind her. How not recent, she said. He considered this. The end of the 17th century, he said. Give or take. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a dare. She thought about a friend with a glass of wine and an idea. She thought about the precise random vector of accident that had led her across that gala hall. She thought about what Caius had said about things that happened in the first second, before any reasoning that the rest of you spent a long time catching up to. I should tell you something too, she said. Yes? I almost canceled Saturday. I had the message typed. I know, he said. She stared at him. How do you know that? Because you're someone who would have planned how to cancel before deciding not to. He said it without judgment, with the simple accuracy of a person who had been paying attention. I'm glad you didn't. You didn't know I would. No, he agreed. I didn't. A pause. That was the interesting part. The thing about Caius, she was learning, was that he never did anything that required walking back. He was not a person who escalated and then retreated. He said what he meant at the pace that he meant it, and then he waited, which was the patience again, the patience of centuries, filtered down into something that in a shorter-lived person would have looked like restraint, but in him was more fundamental than that. It was simply the way time worked for him. He had so much of it that he could afford to let things arrive at their own speed. She was not always sure she had the same patience. She was 31 and had a habit of thinking 3 steps ahead, which was an asset professionally and occasionally in her private life, a way of exhausting herself with futures that hadn't happened yet. She caught herself doing it with Caius, and then caught herself catching herself and tried to do what he did, which was to simply be in the specific hour that was actually occurring. He told her things, slowly, over different evenings. Not all at once, not in the way of a confession, but in the way of someone who has been alone with information for a very long time, and is learning, carefully, that it is possible to share it. He told her about France in 1347, which had not been the way history books described it, which was to say it had been worse, and also in some specific ways stranger. Human beings were not very different in their essentials, but their contexts shifted in ways that changed what the essentials meant. He told her about a city he had lived in for 60 years that no longer existed. He told her that he had watched 3 languages die, by which he meant watch them shift and simplify into something that preserved the structure but lost the specific music, the way you watch a face change over decades when you love someone who ages and you don't. That last thing he did not say directly. He said it sideways, talking about a language, and she heard what was underneath it. Did you love someone who aged? She said. He was quiet. Yes, what was that like? It was, he said after a long pause, the education that everything since has been a footnote to. He looked at his hands. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because it's precise. You learn things from loving someone inside their mortality that you cannot learn any other way. About what time means, about what a life is. He paused. About your own nature. She thought about what it was to love someone through their entire life, and then to continue. She thought about the 60 years after. She thought about the house with the furniture that could be left behind without grief, and understood it differently. Is that why you were indoors for several years, she said. He glanced at her. Not startled, but considering. Among reasons, he said. She did not push. She had learned that with him, not to push, that the information came when it was ready, and that forcing it served neither of them. It was a different way of being with another person than she was accustomed to. She was accustomed to a more conversational equilibrium, the back and forth of two people exchanging information in roughly equal measure. With Caius, the exchange was not equal, and never would be. He had simply been alive longer and carried more, and she had found that this did not make her feel diminished, but rather very specifically present. The way you feel present when you are in a room with something ancient that is choosing to look at you. She told him things too. She told him about her father, who had died when she was 16, and who she had loved with the particular fierceness of a person who has not yet learned that people leave, and who had therefore been blindsided by the leaving in a way that she had spent 15 years subsequently trying to account for in the planning and listing and early mornings and the routes to work that never varied. She told him this without having fully articulated it to herself before, the connection between her father and her efficiency, and she was not sure she would have seen it as clearly as she did saying it to someone who understood the specific weight of loss that did not simply resolve into normal life. He listened. He did not say I'm sorry in the reflexive way of people who say I'm sorry because they don't know what else to do with someone else's grief. He said, 16 is a very particular age to lose someone. Is there a better age? She said. No. He said, but 16 is a particular one. You're old enough to understand everything, and not yet old enough to have had time to prepare for it. She had thought, over the years, that she was essentially fine about her father, that 15 years was long enough to arrive at something like peace. Talking to Caius, she understood that what she had arrived at was not peace, but competence. She had become very competent at living inside the loss. Those were, she was beginning to see, not the same thing. January arrived, and the loan exhibition ended, and the pieces went back in their vehicle with the two silent men, and the gallery returned to its normal dimensions without them. Mara stood in the empty wall space where the seascape had been for 2 months, and thought about things that had been somewhere and survived, and weren't pretending they hadn't. She took a photograph of the empty wall, which she could not have explained if asked. She did not try. Caius texted her that evening. Not called, not arranged, just a message that said, "The walls look like that for a while." She wrote back, "You've done this before." He replied, "Taken things down." Yes, always there was a pause and then another message. It doesn't mean the things weren't there. She read this in her flat with her phone warm in her hand and felt something move in her chest that she had been not quite looking at directly for several weeks. She had been managing it with the same competence she managed things, keeping it in her peripheral vision, aware of its dimensions without confronting its name. She looked at it now. She named it. Then she put her phone down and sat with it for a while, the way you sit with something you have decided to stop managing and start feeling. The next time she saw him, she said, "I think we should talk about what this is." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think we should." They were in his house, in the sitting room that was clean and spare, and had one very old rug that was clearly the thing he had permitted himself to love, the worn thing he had kept through rooms and years. She sat on one side of it, and he sat on the other, and outside the city moved past the windows in its indifferent way. I'm not going to pretend, she said, that what I feel is simple or that I've fully understood it. I don't think you want me to pretend that. No, he said, and I'm aware that there are things about this that I should be more careful about than I am. She paused. I'm aware of what you are. I'm aware of what the difference is between us. The difference is significant, he said quietly. I know. She looked at him. But I've been thinking about what you said, about things that happen in the first second. Before reasoning. She paused. I think I understand what you meant. He was very still. Mara, I'm not being impulsive, she said. I've been thinking about this for 2 months. For me, that's practically geological. Something happened to his face then, something she had not seen on it before. The specific unguardedness of a person whose control has been surprised by something it did not have a plan for. He looked at her with those storm gray eyes, that deep particular gray, and for the first time she saw something on the surface that was also on the surface, and not just an indicator of depth. I don't know, he said slowly, how to do this carefully enough. Carefully enough for what? She said. For you, he said. For what you deserve. A pause. I am not accustomed to, he stopped. Restarted, I have learned over a long time to be careful not to need things. Because things end. Because people, he stopped again. I am not practiced at this. She looked at him. She thought about several centuries of learning not to need things. She thought about the house with the furniture that could be left. She thought about the one rug. I know, she said. I can see that. She paused. I'm not asking you to not be careful. I'm asking you to not use careful as a reason not to try. He looked at her for a long time. That, he said, is a very precise distinction. I told you, she said. I'm good at understanding things. There was a night in February when it snowed, which it rarely did in the city, and which the city handled with the dramatic incompetence of a place that has never adequately prepared for the obvious. Mara walked to his house because the buses had stopped, and the taxis were impossible, and she had been halfway there already when the snow started, and it had seemed more practical to continue than to turn back. She arrived at his door wet-haired, and carrying her shoes in one hand, because the heels had been a mistake, and she had decided midway down his street to simply carry them. He opened the door before she knocked. She was not certain how he had known she was there, and had learned to be uncurious about these things, the specific advantages of his nature that manifested quietly and consistently. The awareness of things nearby, the hearing that was different from hers, the sense that the world was slightly more legible to him in ways that she was still mapping. He looked at her wet hair, and the shoes in her hand, and her feet on his doorstep in December socks, with a small hole at the left toe. He looked at her for a moment, with that precision, and then he stepped back and let her in, and said nothing about the shoes, or the wet hair, or the hole in the sock. She sat in the kitchen, which was the warmest room, while he made tea with the focused efficiency of someone who takes the making of tea seriously, which she had discovered he did, and she watched him and thought about all the kitchens he had stood in over several centuries making things for people, all the domestic moments that had accumulated into his understanding of what a life felt like from the inside. She thought about the 16th century and the 17th, and a language that had died, and a person he had loved through their entire mortality. He set the tea in front of her and sat down across the table. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The snow outside the window came down in the quiet, indifferent way of weather that has no opinion about what it interrupts. Tell me something, she said. Something you've never told anyone. He looked at her. Considering why? Because I've been sitting in this kitchen for 6 weeks, on various evenings, and I want to know something that isn't already in the record. A pause. Then, when I first came to this city, he said, I spent 2 weeks in a park, just sitting. I had a room, a perfectly adequate room, but I would leave it every morning and go to the park and sit on the same bench and watch the city moving around me. He paused. I had been alone for a long time before that. A place with a specific number of people, a small number of people, and I had come to the city because I thought I wanted. He stopped. I didn't know what I wanted. I knew I wanted to be near people. I sat on the bench and watched them, and I didn't talk to anyone for 2 weeks. How long ago was that? She said. 1891. She looked at him. And then? And then I bought the house. He looked at his hands around his own cup. I found the rug at a market. I bought it without thinking. I'd never bought something without thinking before. Something domestic. Something for staying. He paused. I remember that clearly. The man selling it asked me if I wanted it wrapped. I said no. I carried it home. She looked at him and felt the kitchen and the snow outside, and the tea going warm between her palms, and thought about a man carrying a rug home through a 19th century city and deciding, without quite deciding, to stay. She thought about the bench in the park, and 2 weeks of watching. She thought about the specific loneliness of being in a city and not yet being of it. I'm glad you stayed, she said. He looked at her, just looked. The expression on his face was the one she had come to know best, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite anything with a name, but that she had learned to read as the surface movement of something much larger underneath. Yes, he said, quietly, so am I. She stayed that night. She slept in the spare room that was clean, and had the quality of a room that was ready for someone without knowing when the someone would come. And in the morning she woke to the sound of him making breakfast in the kitchen below, and the snow still on the ground outside, and something in her that had been held carefully for a long time, shifting into a different position. Not falling, not breaking, just settling into a truer shape. She came downstairs. He had made eggs and toast, and was reading something at the kitchen table, a very old book that was not quite in a language she recognized. He looked up when she came in. He said good morning, and pushed a plate across to her, and went back to his book. She sat down and ate, and the snowlight came in through the window, and the kitchen was warm, and the book he was reading was 700 years old, and she was 31 and entirely uncertain about the future, and for the first time in a very long time that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. What is that? She said, nodding at the book. A medical text, he said. 14th century. I'm trying to remember if it's accurate. And? Largely no, he said. He turned a page. But they tried. She ate her toast. She thought about trying. She thought about the specific dignity of attempting things with the information you have, even when the information is incomplete. She thought about sitting on a dare at a charity gala and walking across a room before the reasoning part of her brain could catch up. She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man who was several hundred years old and was reading a medieval medical text over breakfast and had made her eggs, and thought, this is a very strange life I am choosing. And then, good. The thing she had not fully prepared for was other people. Not in the abstract, but in the specific. Mr. Fitch noticed first, or noticed something, a quality of distraction she had not previously been susceptible to, the way she looked at her phone with an expression he was too professional to comment on, but not too observant to miss. He said nothing. He was, in this respect, a better employer than she had given him credit for. Lena was less restrained. You look different, Lena said, over lunch in a cafe that was too loud for privacy, and therefore paradoxically perfect for the conversation they were having. You look like someone who's sleeping better. I'm sleeping fine, Mara said. That's what I mean. You used to sleep fine in the way that meant you were unconscious for 7 hours and awake for one at 4 in the morning running lists. Now you look like you're actually sleeping. Mara looked at her menu. You can't tell that from looking at someone. I've known you for 11 years, Lena said. I can tell. She set her own menu down. How is the vampire? He's well. That's it? He's well? He made breakfast on Saturday. Lena stared at her. He made you breakfast. He made breakfast. I was there for it. That's Mara. That's significant. I know. She did know. She had learned enough about how Caius moved through the world to understand what was ordinary for him and what was not, and making someone breakfast was, she suspected, not ordinary. The house existed for him, not for guests, the spare room notwithstanding. The kitchen was used. He ate. She had gathered that his nature required something closer to normal consumption than the stories suggested, but it was a functional relationship with food, rather than a domestic one. Making eggs and toast for someone was choosing to do something he did not need to do in the way that he had not needed to do it, and she understood this about him now. She understood other things too. She understood that he had a particular aversion to crowds that was not anxiety, but something older. The accumulated overstimulation of a very long life spent in a body that experienced sensory information with more precision than a human one. She understood that he slept very little and read a great deal and had opinions about translation that were occasionally heated, which was the closest she had seen him come to genuine irritation, some scholarly transgression against a text he had read in its original form. She understood that he found her funny in a way that surprised him every time, not in the sense that she was performing comedy, but in the sense that her specific observations, the dry sideways things she said about the world, landed on him as genuinely unexpected, and she found she liked this, liked being the thing that surprised him. There was a Tuesday evening in late February when she was at his house, and they were both reading. She on the old rug that she had adopted as her preferred spot, and he in the chair that was clearly his preferred spot, and the lamp was warm, and the city outside was doing its Tuesday evening things, and she was aware, in the specific way you become aware of something true, that this was comfortable. That the room was comfortable, and the silence was comfortable, and she was comfortable in a way that was not performed or managed or efficient, but just simply was. She looked up from her book. He was reading, his attention fully on the page, that complete focus he brought to things that interested him. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about everything that was not ordinary about this, and about what was extraordinary, but also about what was just. Present, the lamp, the rug, the Tuesday. A man reading across the room who had been alive for centuries and had sat on a bench in a park in 1891 for 2 weeks before deciding to stay. Caius, she said. He looked up. Yes, I'm glad I kissed you, she said. At the gala. I know you said you don't generally allow Mara. I wanted to say it. Properly, not sorry. Glad. He looked at her for a moment. Then, he set his book down on the arm of the chair. He did not say anything for long enough that she wondered if she had misjudged the moment, which was a thing she occasionally still did with him. Mistook the stillness for absence, when it was actually just the pace at which he processed things that mattered to him. Then he said, "So am I." She looked back at her book. She was not actually reading. She was sitting in the lamplight on the old rug in his house, feeling the specific warmth of having said a true thing and had it returned, and she thought that this simple reciprocal truth, was something she had not realized she had been missing until it arrived. He came and sat beside her. Not in the chair, beside her, on the rug, which was a departure from his usual arrangement and felt therefore deliberate. He did not make a production of it. He simply sat. And after a moment she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was cool in the way she had learned was just his temperature, not absence of warmth but different warmth, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the old rug in the lamplight, and she read nothing, and he read nothing, and outside the city was Tuesday, and inside everything was very still and very certain. He said, very quietly, "Into the top of her hair, there is something I should tell you." She stilled, not with fear, with attention. "Tell me." "What I am," he said carefully, "has consequences that you should understand." Before he paused. "There are things I can offer you, and things I cannot. I can be here, I intend to be here. But you will age, Mara, and I will not, and that is not something I can change, and not something you have fully had to think about yet, because we have only been this for a short time. She sat with this. She had thought about it peripherally in the way she thought about most uncomfortable things, in the corner of her vision rather than directly. Now she looked at it directly. She thought about what it meant. She thought about what it had meant to him before, with someone he had loved through their mortality, what the education had cost. She understood why he was saying it now, carefully, while they were on a rug in lamplight and not in some charged or emotionally complicated moment. He was giving her the information at a time when she could take it properly. I know, she said. You know it now, he said. Knowing it and living with it are different things. Yes, she said, but I've been living with something like that already. She paused. My father left when I was 16. Everyone leaves eventually. What you're telling me is not new information about the world. It's just more precise. He was quiet for a long time. She felt his arm tighten slightly, not much. Just the small adjustment of someone holding more carefully what they are already holding. I don't want to cause you grief, he said. I know. She turned her head to look up at him. And I don't want you to be alone anymore. The thing that happened to his face then was something she had not seen before. Quiet and complete. A very old face, doing something that was not performance and not restraint, and not the careful surface management she had learned in the early weeks. It was simply him, without the management, looking at her. And she thought that this was what several centuries of careful withholding looked like when it stopped. Spring arrived, as it always did, without particularly asking whether winter was finished. The city greened and lightened, and the gallery had a new exhibition, contemporary work this time, a young painter from Dublin whose canvases were very large and very alive, the kind of painting that demanded space, and got it. Mara managed the installation with the particular focused satisfaction she always brought to work she found meaningful, and went home each evening tired in the good way, the way of someone who has used themselves properly. She told her mother about Caius in March. This was, she had been aware for some time, the conversation she was most uncertain about. Not because her mother was unreasonable, but because her mother was perceptive in the specific way of someone who had raised Mara and knew exactly which questions would find the places she was still figuring out. She did not tell her mother what Caius was. She was not ready to navigate that, and was not certain it was a conversation that had a version which ended well. She told her mother that she was seeing someone, that he was older, that he was private, that she was happy. Her mother said, "You sound different." Different how? Less like you're narrating your own life, and more like you're in it. Mara sat with this on the phone for a moment. She thought about the list-making and the routes to work and the careful efficiency with which she had been managing her life for 15 years. Yes, she said. I think that's right. Her mother did not ask more than that. She was, in this respect, better than most. She said she wanted to meet him when Mara was ready, and Mara said yes, and meant it, and filed the complication of that particular introduction for later. Caius met Lena in April, which happened inadvertently when Lena appeared at the gallery on a Friday afternoon with the energy of someone who had been working up to something all week. Mara saw her expression when she came through the door, and then saw her expression change when she saw Caius, who was there to return a document he had borrowed for reference, standing at Mara's desk with the easy unself-consciousness of someone who had stopped needing to explain his presence. Lena looked at him. She looked at Mara. She looked back at him with the particular expression of someone who has heard a thing described and is now measuring the description against the reality. Caius looked at Lena with the measured attention he gave new things. The moment lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "You're the one from the gala," Lena said. "I am," he said. "She kissed you." "She did." And then Yulina gestured between them with the vague but sufficient gesture of someone indicating a situation. Yes, he said. Something moved in his expression. Thank you, he added, for the dare. Lena stared at him. Then she turned to Mara with the expression of someone who has not been given the complete picture and is reassessing everything. I like him, she said. I didn't expect to, but I do. Caius looked faintly amused, or as faintly amused as his face permitted, which was not a large expression but was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The feeling, he said, is mutual. Mara watched this small exchange and felt something warm and slightly disorganized in her chest, the particular feeling of two parts of your life recognizing each other. She had been, she realized, keeping him in a separate part of herself without quite meaning to, the careful compartmentalizing habit of a person who had learned to protect the things she valued by keeping them where they couldn't be reached. She had not been doing it deliberately. But she had been doing it. She stopped doing it after that Friday. It was a small change, and a large one. She talked about him to her colleagues in the natural way of someone who is not hiding a thing. She made plans that included him without the mental negotiation of whether including him was the right move. She left a book at his house without carrying it home because she would be back and there was no reason to carry it. The book stayed on the table beside the old rug. The following week there was a second book. The week after that, a jacket on the hook by his door and her preferred tea in his kitchen cupboard because he had noticed she made a face at the kind he bought and had replaced it without comment. She noticed these things accumulating and let them accumulate. She noticed that he rearranged slightly to accommodate them, the hook, the tea, the small adjustments of a space that is used to being singular making room for something additional, and she thought about the bench in 1891 and the rug at the market and the decision to stay made without quite being decided. She thought that perhaps this was how he did things. Small decisions that accreted into the large one, choices made at the level of the practical that revealed, in their accumulation, what was true. One evening she asked him, "What happens when something gets too complicated to manage the way you manage it?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She paused, looking for the right word. Considered. About things. Careful. I wonder what happens when something isn't possible to be careful about. He was quiet for a moment. It used to be more difficult, he said, the loss of control, the things that arrived outside the expected. He paused. I have had a long time to get better at it. Has it helped? She said. Getting better at it? In some respects. He looked at her. In other respects, the things I have gotten better at tolerating are simply things I have gotten better at tolerating. The tolerance is not the same as peace. She nodded. She understood this. She had gotten very good at tolerating a particular arrangement of her life. The tolerance was not peace. What does peace look like? She said. For you. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, I think it looks like this. Like what is happening now. A pause. I am not certain yet, but I think so. It was Lena who pointed out, in the way Lena pointed out most things, which was directly, and without having been asked, that Mara had been with Caius for 6 months and had never once asked him about the obvious practical reality of what being with him meant. Not philosophically. Practically, Lena said. Have you talked about what happens? Long term, Mara repeated. You're 31. He's however old he is. At some point you're going to be 40, and he's going to look exactly the same. A pause. And then, 60. And I know, Mara said. Have you talked about it? Not in those terms. Mara, Lena, some things you talk about when you're ready. Are you ready? She thought about it honestly. She thought about what he had told her on the rug in February, that she would age and he would not. She thought about her response, that everyone left eventually, that this was just more precise. She had meant it when she said it, and she still meant it. But Lena was not wrong that the precision deserved to be examined rather than managed. She had been allowing herself to be in it, which was good, which was what she had needed to do. But being in it and thinking about what being in it meant were both necessary, and she had been attending more to the first than the second. She raised it on a Thursday in May, a specific evening she had chosen for no reason she could have named, except that it felt like the right weather and the right quiet. They were in the kitchen, after dinner, the kitchen that was becoming in some functional sense as much hers as his, which was the kind of thing she would not have predicted in September and had stopped being surprised by in April. She said, "I want to talk about something." He looked up. "Yes, long term," she said. "What that means, what it could mean." She paused. "What you've seen it mean before, when there was someone." He set down what he was holding. He gave her his full attention, which was, she had come to understand, the most complete attention she had ever been given by another person. The specific focus of someone for whom attention was not divided across the many distractions of a life lived at the pace of modern things. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything," she said. "Or at least as much as you can tell me." So he told her. He told her what it had looked like before, in the 17th century, when he had loved someone through the full length of a human life, and then beyond it. He told her what the good years had been like, and what the hard years had been like, and what it had been like to be, at the end, unmatched in a way that nothing had prepared him for, despite knowing from the beginning that this was the shape it would take. He told her that he had been very alone after that for a very long time, and that he had thought, in certain periods of that loneliness, that he would not do it again, that the cost was too specific. And then, she said, and then, he said, a woman at a charity gala kissed me on a dare. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those gray eyes that were not simply gray, and she thought about September and the cold quality she had named, and what it actually was, which was depth, which was someone who had decided that the cost of connecting was too high, and had maintained that decision for a long time, and was now, in front of her, in the kitchen light, in May, reconsidering. "I need you to know," he said, "that I understand what I am asking you to take on. If this becomes what I think it is becoming." He paused. "I am not able to offer you the ordinary version of a life. I cannot give you someone who will age with you. I cannot pretend that what I am is simple or that the complications will stay small. There will be a point at which we cannot be seen together easily. There will be a point at which you will make choices because of what I am that you would not have otherwise had to make." His voice was steady and very honest. "I want you to know all of this before I know it," she said. Maracaias. She looked at him. "I knew some version of it on the second day. I've been thinking about it since February. I'm not," she stopped, restarted. "I'm not someone who makes decisions without understanding what I'm deciding." She paused. "And I have understood, for a while now, that what I am deciding is whether the thing I have with you is worth the shape it's going to have." She looked at him. "And I think it is. I think it is very much worth it." He was very still. "You're certain?" "I'm 31, and I've been planning things since I was 17, she said. "I don't make any decision more than once." A pause. "This is my once." Something happened to his face. Something she had not quite seen on it before in this specific arrangement, which was all the things she had seen individually. The unguarded, the careful, the depth, the not quite smile, all of them at the same time. Overlapping, the face of someone who had been holding a great deal together for a very long time, and was, in this moment, not holding it so tightly. He reached across the kitchen table and took her hand. Not dramatically. Just held it, the way you hold something you have decided belongs there and intend to keep. "Yes," he said. "Just that. Yes," She thought that in his language, in the weight he gave to specific words, this was the most he had said all evening. They told no one the full truth, and everyone something of it, which was the only version of honesty available to them, and which Mara had come to think of not as a compromise but as a translation, the version of a true thing rendered into the language the listener could actually hold. She told her mother that Caius was private, older, unusual, extraordinary. She told Mr. Fitch that her relationship with the Foundation's director had become personal, which he received with the expression of a man who had suspected as much and had already decided his gallery interests and her happiness were not in conflict. She told Lena everything, which was the only arrangement Lena would accept. Lena, to her considerable credit, had arrived at a complicated peace with the full picture. She had spent 2 days asking questions that Mara could not answer, and one afternoon on the internet reading things she then wished she had not, and had emerged from the process with the expression of someone who has processed an unusual amount of information and is choosing consciously to focus on the parts that are good. The parts that were good were, Mara looked like someone who was in her own life rather than narrating it. Caius had said thank you for the dare with an ease that meant he meant it. He had made breakfast. The breakfast thing, Lena said, keeps coming back to me. Why? Because it's domestic, Lena said. Because you don't do that for someone you're not. You don't make breakfast for someone, unless you mean something by it. It doesn't matter how old you are. She paused. It matters that he meant something by it. Mara thought about eggs and toast and the snow outside, and the medical text and 700 years, and the specific warmth of being handed something simple by someone who did not have to offer it and had chosen to. Yes, she said. He did. The summer was long and warm, and they were in it together, which was the best way to be in a long, warm summer. They went to a coast that Caius had known in a different version, the town much changed, the water unchanged, and he stood at the edge of it and looked out with the expression of someone measuring the distance between memory and present, and finding the gap enormous and manageable in equal parts. She stood beside him. She did not say anything. She was learning, finally, after 31 years of filling silence with language, that some of the best things were silent. He turned to her. There was a harbor here, he said, in the 17th century, much smaller. I came here because I needed to be somewhere the sea was. Did it help? The sea always helps. He looked at her. You are also, I have found, very useful for the same purpose. She laughed. He looked at her in the way he always looked at her when she laughed, that expression she had come to think of as his version of warmth, not performed warmth but the real kind, the kind that surprises the person feeling it. That is the most practical compliment I have ever received, she said. I'm a practical man, he said. You are, she said, which is very unexpected, given everything. He looked back at the water. The sea did what it always did, which was to ignore entirely whether any of the above was significant and continue its own very long concerns. She stood beside him and thought about length, about what it was to be in the presence of something that did not measure time the way she did, the sea or the man. Both of them operating on a scale that made her 31 years feel brief and specific and exactly the right size for what they were. She had been thinking, over the summer, about what he had said in February, about things that happen in the first second before reasoning begins. She had been thinking about the walk across the gala hall, the dare, the 2 seconds that had changed the specific direction of her life by the precise degree necessary to arrive here, at a coast in summer, beside someone who had been standing at water's edge for centuries. She thought about what Lena had said. When is the last time something happened to you that you didn't plan for? She thought that the answer she would give now was different from the one she would have given in September. What are you thinking? He said. About the dare, she said. He looked at her. What about it? I almost didn't, she said. I almost sent the cancellation message. I almost didn't walk across the room. I almost did about 17 things that would have sent everything in a different direction. She paused. I keep thinking about how thin the margin was. He was quiet for a moment. I don't find that as troubling as I might have expected to, he said. I have found, over a very long time, that the things that happen by small margins are often the things that were going to happen. The margin is just the last piece of resistance before the inevitable. He paused. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. She looked at him. She looked at the sea. She thought about a woman who had spent 15 years being very efficient and very competent and very good at living inside her own life without fully inhabiting it, who had walked across a room on a dare in a green dress and kissed a stranger and looked back and found him watching and said fine without meaning it even slightly. She thought about what it was to finally mean the word you were saying. She took his hand. He looked down at it, at their hands, with the expression of someone who has not yet gotten entirely used to this and perhaps hopes not to. Hopes to remain in the space where it is still slightly unexpected, still slightly more than could have been planned for. She understood this. She intended to stay in it too. Caius, she said. Yes, thank you, she said, for not stopping me. He looked at her and there was in his face everything she had come to know, the depth and the careful and the centuries and the one warm rug and the very old letters and the breakfast made quietly in the snow. All of it, and underneath all of it, the same thing she felt when she said it, the specific gratitude of two people who had, by thin margins and small decisions and a dare that was really an accident, that was really an inevitability, found each other in the particular hall of their particular lives, and decided, with clear eyes and full information, to stay. You chose well, she said, when she kissed him. This time, neither of them was going anywhere. If this story stayed with you, if you caught yourself smiling in that bookshop or holding something careful in that kitchen on the February evening when the snow came down, then it did exactly what it was made to do. Some loves are found by design, and some arrive sideways. Through a dare, through a stranger, through the smallest possible margin between one life and another. What Mara discovered, and what those of us watching her always suspected, is that the most important decisions are rarely the ones we planned. They are the ones we made before we knew we were making them. Share this with someone who needed a story about choosing without a map. Leave a comment telling us which moment stayed with you. Was it the gala, the bookshop, or the breakfast in the snow? Subscribe to Duke Royal Tales, because every week there is another story waiting, another impossible love, built in the most unexpected place. We will see you in the next one.